I arrived at the airport with my luggage stacked neatly beside me, my boarding pass clutched in hand. The terminals were bustling, travelers shuffling in every direction. Rolling bags clattering across polished floors, the hull of announcements weaving through the chaos. My daughter Claire and the kids had already disappeared somewhere in the crowd. I thought I had a quiet few minutes to myself before heading off on the long-awaited trip. The one I had promised months ago, a special family vacation. Then it happened. My son-in-law Brett Sullivan, or at least the man Claire had married and called Brett, snatched my boarding pass in the middle of the throng, ripped it in half, and tossed it onto the floor. He barked, loud enough for half the terminal to hear, "Stay home. Old man, take care of the dogs." The sound of tearing paper reverberated through my chest like a blade. My Furters 500 flight, representing countless hours of planning, excitement, and expense, had just been destroyed in one swift motion. Travelers nearby paused mid-step, some staring in disbelief, others quietly shaking their heads. My daughter Claire's mouth fell open, Mason froze where he stood, and Grace, barely 5, started to cry, clutching her Mickey Mouse tightly to her chest. Brett looked at me with that same smug smile, convinced he had won. I remained calm. My chest was still, my heartbeat steady, even as every fiber of my body wanted to roar. At 65, I'd faced hostile boardrooms, negotiations with CEOs twice my age, and even more treacherous adversaries. I had weathered the loss of Margaret, my wife of 32 years, and endured grief that reshaped my understanding of strength. I knew when I saw a performance. Brett thought he was dealing with an old man, weak in spirit, easy to manipulate. "Dad, we can't just leave the dogs," Claire pleaded softly, a hint of desperation in her voice. "Change of plans, Pops," Brett continued, ignoring her. "Family emergency. You're staying here." I nodded, slowly, deliberately. There was indeed an emergency. And it wasn't the one Brett thought. I walked past the chaos toward the customer service desk, ignoring his protests. "Dad. Wait, you can't." I slid my Chase Sapphire Reserve across the counter. My voice was quiet but precise. "Cancel all reservations. Flights, hotel, rental car, everything." The agent hesitated. "Sir, I am the cardholder. Cancel it all. No exceptions." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the red cancellation warnings blinking like tiny alarm signals. I watched calmly as she processed them one by one. Brett's face, visible across the terminal, shifted from confidence to confusion, then to panic. He began shouting, "Dad! Wait! Let's talk about this." But I didn't turn. By the time she handed me the confirmation, every reservation tied to the trip had been cancelled. Outbound and return flights, the Gaylord Texan Resort. 5 nights. The rental car, everything. I deactivated his supplementary card while I was at it. The name Brett Sullivan. Effective emails and walked toward the exit, maintaining the calm of a man who had spent decades mastering control. Brett followed, fuming, but I kept my pace measured. When I slid into the taxi, the cabbie looked like I was a man on a mission. "Where to?" "The Peninsula, downtown," I said. As we pulled away, I watched Brett standing in the terminal, fists clenched, voice rising. His free ride, the illusion of power he had carefully cultivated over the years, was slipping through his fingers. At the Peninsula, the familiar quiet luxury welcomed me. The suite was as I remembered, tasteful, serene. A world apart from the chaos of the terminal. I ordered room service, a ribeye, medium rare coffee, and sat at the mahogany desk Margaret had given me years ago. Her inscription on the first page of the leather notebook flashed in my mind, "May you always know what you're worth." I should have remembered that sooner. I picked up the phone and called Chase Private Client Services. "Michael Stevens. I need the supplementary card associated with Brett Sullivan frozen immediately. Security concern, unauthorized charges, flag it as fraud." "Don't, Mr. Clayton," came the calm professional reply. "Any other changes require your physical presence." "Perfect." I hung up and made a few more calls. Internet service cancelled at the Lincoln Park house. Utilities and climate control accounts deactivated. Every piece of the puzzle Brett had been relying on to maintain control of our lives was now firmly in my hands. By evening, I allowed myself a small sense of satisfaction. I had re-established control, but the game was far from. Brett had underestimated me, and that miscalculation would cost him dearly. The next morning, I met Mike O'Brien, my locksmith. We started at the Lincoln Park garage, where Brett had parked the Escalade he never paid for. Mike had the lock open in under a minute. I walked past the garage, toward the backyard kennels. Duke and Maximus, the massive cane corsos, rushed the fence, tails wagging frantically. Their water bowls were green with algae, their food dishes empty. My chest sank. "Since yesterday morning," Mike said quietly. I knelt and called the emergency canine facility I'd arrange. Yes, we need immediate pickup, VP accommodations. They haven't been properly cared for. Within the hour, the dogs were loaded into climate-controlled crates, tails wagging despite the neglect they had endured. I drove the Escalade downtown and parked it in a secure lawn-turn lot. 30 days cash paid in advance. Brett would see the empty garage and realize he no longer controlled the material symbols of his arrogance. Meanwhile, across the city, Brett was unraveling. The internet down, air conditioning inactive, credit cards frozen. He had created chaos for me at the airport, and now he was facing the consequences in reverse. 2 days later, I walked into Leonard Frost's office on the 40th floor of Wacker Drive. Claire and Brett, or Bradley Thompson, as we would soon discover, followed reluctantly. Brett entered with his usual swagger, sweat staining his shirt, expecting a negotiation he had no idea he was walking into. Leonard slid the deeds and documents of precision. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice sharp, "do you believe you own 247 North Lincoln Park West?" Brett's confident smirk faltered. "We own it," he said. Wrong. Claire's eyes widened. Leonard explained that she was the sole owner. That Brett had contributed nothing legally, and that he had been operating under a fraudulent identity. I watched Brett's face drain of color as Leonard revealed Bradley Thompson's true identity: a fugitive from justice, wanted for securities fraud in Las Vegas, with an active FBI warrant. Claire's hand went to her mouth, shaking. The man she had married, the father of her children, was a professional con artist. My chest tightened. But I remained calm, as I had at the airport. Now, the stakes were higher: protecting Claire and the kids, securing assets, and ensuring that Bradley Thompson faced justice for the damage he had inflicted over years. We acted swiftly. Divorce papers were drawn, restraining orders prepared, supervised visitation arranged. Bradley Thompson, realizing his position was untenable, signed quietly. He had no choice. The legal system, my planning, and Leonard's expertise ensured the safety of my family, and the return of everything he had assumed he could control. Even after the immediate threats were neutralized, I did not rest. I submitted an anonymous tip to the FBI with Bradley's location, arrest records, and mugshot. Within 41 hours, federal agents apprehended him, extradited him to Nevada, and he was sentenced to 12 years for securities fraud. Justice had been served, not through anger or violence, but through methodical strategy, control, and patience. 6 months later, I returned to Lincoln Park. The house was warm and alive, Claire smiling in the kitchen, Mason and Grace playing in the snow outside with Duke and Maximus, now healthy and cared for. The children's laughter, the smell of French toast and bacon, the easy conversation, all of it reminded me why every step had been necessary. Sitting at the table, Claire explained that Bradley was allowed one a week from Nevada. Mason and Grace exchanged glances. "He's still our dad," Mason said cautiously, "but he's not part of our family anymore, not like you are, Pops." I smiled, kneeling to Mason's level. Family isn't about money. It's about respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than what someone can become. The lessons were clear: love is not enabling. Patience must be balanced with action, and dignity cannot be bought with checks or manipulated through fear. By saying no, by acting decisively, I had reclaimed not only control over material assets but also over my family's safety and moral compass. Looking back, the torn boarding pass was not a loss. It was a revelation. It forced me to see the truth that enabling had built a cage, and breaking free required courage, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to justice. I never made it to Texas that summer, but I gained something far more valuable: a family that respected boundaries, a legacy of integrity, and the knowledge that true love sometimes means stepping back, letting consequences unfold, and standing firm in what is right. Duke and Maximus played in the snow outside, healthy and happy. Claire cooked breakfast with pride, Mason showed me his math test, and Grace proudly displayed her Disney savings jar. Life was quiet, full, and right. The chaos Brett had tried to impose had been replaced with clarity, order, and love built on respect, not obligation. That day, I understood a truth I had long forgotten. The most powerful lessons are earned through frontation and action. And sometimes, the act of tearing up a boarding pass is exactly what is needed to see who truly values dignity, respect, and family. I poured a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the morning light, and smiled. Justice, patience, and clarity had prevailed. And for once, I slept knowing that my family, my children, and my grandchildren were safe, respected, and loved for who they were, not for what they had or were given. The lesson was simple but profound: true power lies not in force, nor in money, but in calm action, moral clarity, and the courage to set boundaries. And when those boundaries are crossed, it is never too late to act. I looked out the window at the snow-covered city, thinking about Margaret, thinking about Claire, thinking about the children. I had done what was necessary, not for revenge, but for protection, for dignity, and for love. The torn boarding pass, once a symbol of betrayal, had become a marker of clarity, strength, and a family finally free from deceit. The sun rose slowly over Lincoln Park, glinting off the snow and Lake Michigan beyond. And as I took a sip of my scotch, I knew that the most important victories are not the ones seen by the world, they are the quiet, measured triumphs that safeguard what truly matters: family, respect, and integrity. The days that followed were quieter but deliberate. I spent mornings reviewing bank statements, insurance policies, and utility accounts, ensuring that every thread of control was firmly in my hands. Brett, or Bradley Thompson as I now knew him, had been reduced to a shadow of the man who had once strutted through my terminal, confident and arrogant. Every call from him to Claire was monitored, logged, and documented. His words, once commanding and manipulative, have no power. Claire, initially overwhelmed, began to find her voice again. She cooked meals without hesitation, signed checks for household bills, and planned the children's schedules independently. Mason, usually shy and hesitant, spoke proudly about his schoolwork and projects. Grace's laughter returned to the house, her Disney jar no longer a symbol of what she wanted but of what she had earned. I watched all of it quietly, allowing the family to rebuild, stepping in only when necessary. One evening, as snow blanketed the Lincoln Park neighborhood, I sat in the living room with Claire and the kids, a fire crackling in the hearth. Claire looked at me, eyes soft, tearful but steady. "Dad, I didn't realize I didn't know how much he was controlling everything. Thank you for stepping in, for saving us." I shook my head gently. "I didn't save you from him. I helped you see what you were missing, you saved yourselves. I just gave you the tools and the space to act." Mason leaned against my knee. "Pops, why did you do all of this? Why not just let him take what he wanted?" I stroked his hair. "Because sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is step in. But love isn't giving people everything they want. Love is setting. Is protecting people from harm they don't even see yet." Grace tugged at my sleeve, her voice curious. "Does this mean he's never coming back?" I glanced out the window at Duke and Maximus rolling in the snow. "He's gone, sweetheart. For now, and if he tries again, we'll handle it the same way. Calmly, with clarity, and together." The next morning I reviewed the FBI case updates. Bradley Thompson's arrest in Bucktown had led to multiple charges. Not only for the fraudulent loans he had attempted with our house as collateral, but also for previously undiscovered activities linked to elderly victims in Nevada. The reports detailed his network, his aliases, and the schemes he had orchestrated. Every piece of paper was a testament to how a careful, calculated approach to justice could undo even the most cunning of con artists. Yet, despite the legal victories, the personal lessons were the ones I valued most. I reflected on Margaret's words, the way she had always reminded me that patience without action was a cage of its own making. I had spent too many years enabling, letting guilt and love cloud judgment. The torn boarding pass had been more than a disruption, it had been a wake-up call. A challenge to reclaim not only material control but the moral and emotional sovereignty of my family. I began documenting everything, the steps I had taken, the calls made, the freezes on accounts, the interactions with the FBI and the legal maneuvers. Not for revenge, not for pride, but as a guide. A record to ensure that this knowledge could be shared. A blueprint for others who might face manipulation and deceit disguised as family, friendship, or trust. And the time Christmas arrived, the Lincoln Park house felt alive again. Lights twinkled, the fireplace warmed the room, and laughter filled the hallways. Mason and Grace were excited about presents, not just for themselves but for the joy of giving. Claire prepared breakfast, her movements confident and unhurried. The weight of past manipulation lifted from her shoulders. As I poured my coffee, I watched the snow fall softly outside. Duke and Maximus bounded through the yard, healthy and free from neglect. The house, once a battlefield of control and deceit, had transformed into a sanctuary. I felt a rare sense of peace, not because the conflict was over, but because the family had been restored, grounded in respect, boundaries, and love. Later that day, Claire approached me with a hesitant question. "Dad, do you think we could have avoided all this if I'd noticed the signs earlier?" I smiled, though my chest tightened with memory. Maybe, maybe not. The truth is, deception can be very convincing, especially when wrapped in love. But what we can control is how we respond once we see it. That's the difference between being trapped and being free. Mason tugged at my sleeve again. Pops, can we go skiing this year? I chuckled. We'll see, sport. But next time we'll plan it together, every step, no surprises. No torn tickets, just preparation and fun. Grace hugged my leg tightly. And can we take the dogs? I looked at Duke and Maximus, tails wagging, paws crunching the snow. Always. Weeks turned into months. Claire handled the house, bills, and the children with newfound confidence. The kids thrived, their schoolwork and hobbies flourishing under a calm, structured environment. Every once in a while, a reminder would arrive, FBI updates, court documents, or even a brief letter from Bradley Thompson's attorney, but it no longer rattled us. The balance of power had shifted, permanently and decisively. One afternoon, while reviewing a letter from Chase confirming the permanent deactivation of Bradley's supplementary card, I realized the true extent of the lesson. The control Brett, or Bradley, had assumed came not from our failure as a family, but from my own reluctance to enforce boundaries earlier. Enabling had been his ally, action was my weapon. And the results spoke for themselves. I called Claire into the study. Sit here, I said, spreading the ledger and documents across the desk. Look at this. Every account. Every property, every measure we've put in place. This isn't about revenge, it's about clarity and security. About making sure that no one, no matter how convincing, can take advantage of you again. Claire studied the papers, a quiet sense of empowerment settling over her. I understand now, she said softly. It's not about fear. It's about control. And boundaries. I nodded. Exactly. Love without boundaries is just a cage. You gave your life and resources to someone you trusted. That's not a mistake. But letting that trust become exploitation, that's something we can correct. The lessons extended beyond finances and security. They were about values, integrity, and the courage to act decisively when moral and ethical lines were crossed. I began mentoring Mason and Grace in small ways, about responsibility, honesty, and the value of hard work. Each lesson grounded them in principles rather than material security. The foundation I had learned was far more important than any check or property deed. One evening, Claire came to the study, holding a letter from the FBI. It was a confirmation that Bradley Thompson's incarceration had uncovered additional victims and ongoing investigations. The man who had tried to manipulate and control us for years was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Claire's eyes shimmered with tears, but they were tears of relief and justice rather than fear. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of months of tension slowly lifting. I poured a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light, and allowed myself a moment to reflect. Margaret would have smiled at the way events unfolded, not because of the triumph over Bradley, but because her lessons had finally been applied. Patience balanced with action, love tempered by boundaries, and the wisdom to recognize when a situation required decisive intervention. The weeks passed. Snow melted into spring, and the Lincoln Park house blossomed with renewed energy. Mason earned top marks in his class, Grace saved diligently in her Disney fund, and Claire managed every responsibility with confidence and pride. Duke and Maximus became neighborhood favorites, their friendly nature a stark contrast to the fear and neglect they had endured under Brett. One afternoon, as I watched the kids play outside, I reflected on the airport that day, the torn boarding pass, the chaos, the confrontation with Brett. That single act, meant to humiliate and control, had become the catalyst for clarity and justice. What Brett had thought was a victory had actually marked the beginning of his downfall and our liberation. I smiled, thinking about the lessons learned. Life had a way of presenting opportunities disguised as crisis. The key was recognizing them, acting with clarity, and never underestimating the value of patience, strategy, and moral courage. The torn boarding pass had been the wake-up call I needed. Not just to protect assets but to protect the essence of family, dignity, and respect. By the time summer arrived, we had settled into a rhythm. Claire was confident in her independence, Mason and Grace thrived in school and activities, and I had reclaimed the role of grandfather, mentor, and guardian. Not a checkbook or enabler. The scars of past mistakes remained, but they were now reminders of lessons learned rather than chains of regret. The most profound realization hit me one afternoon while watching the sunset over Lake Michigan from the Lincoln Park balcony. Brett, or Bradley, had tried to steal our peace, our dignity, and our resources. Yet in the end, it was his choices that led to his undoing, and our choices that ensured the safety, happiness, and integrity of our family. The balance of power, finally, had shifted in favor of justice and love rooted in respect. Duke and Maximus raced across the yard, Mason and Grace laughed, and Claire set the table for dinner. The house was warm, safe, and filled with life. I poured a final glass of scotch, raising it silently to Margaret's memory, to the lesson she had instilled, and to the family that had finally found its equilibrium. I understood now more than ever. Love without boundaries is chaos disguised as care. Action guided by principle is power, and sometimes, a torn boarding pass, a moment of conflict, can reveal what has been hidden all along. Who truly values dignity, respect, and family? The airport had tested me. Brett had challenged me. But in the end, clarity, patience, and strategy had won. And for the first time in years, I could rest knowing that my family's future was secure. Their lives guided by integrity rather than manipulation, and their hearts free from deceit. The lessons of that summer, of that airport confrontation, and of the months that followed, would remain with me and my family forever. True power, I realized, is not in money, control, or intimidation. It is in calm action, moral clarity, and the courage to set boundaries. And sometimes, that courage comes from the most unexpected of places: a torn boarding pass, a moment of audacity, and the refusal to accept less than what is rightfully yours. Months turned into a full year, and Lincoln Park felt like a new world. The house, once a stage for tension, was now a sanctuary. Claire had transformed from someone cautious and controlled by fear into a confident woman, aware of her rights, her boundaries, and the legacy of care she would leave for Mason and Grace. The kids were thriving in ways I hadn't dared to imagine when Brett first tore up my boarding pass. One crisp autumn morning, as leaves fell across the yard, Claire called me into the kitchen. She had a stack of papers in her hand. "Dad, I've been thinking." Her voice wavered slightly. "Want to get everything in order, for us, for the kids, for the future." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "What are you thinking?" She laid the papers out: insurance policies, savings accounts, legal documents for the children's future. "I want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. That we're protected, financially and legally. That Mason and Grace grow up understanding their worth, but also their responsibility." I smiled, pride swelling. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that turns trauma into wisdom. You're learning to protect what matters, not just react to threats." Mason bounded into the room, backpack slung over his shoulder. "Pops, can you help me with my history project?" I ruffled his hair. "Of course. Sport, let's see what you've got." Grace followed, clutching a notebook. "And me, Pops, can I show you my Disney fun plan?" I chuckled. "Absolutely. Let's see how you're saving for the adventures ahead." The family gathered around the kitchen table, papers and notebooks spread out, laughter and chatter blending into a calm, deliberate energy. No tension, no manipulation, no fear, just focus, guidance, and genuine connection. The home was alive again, shaped by respect, boundaries, and shared purpose. I thought back to that airport gate, the torn ticket, the humiliation, the challenge. That moment had felt like defeat. Brett had thought he had the upper hand. He had no idea he handed me the exact leverage I needed to reclaim control, dignity, and justice. Every action he had taken to humiliate or intimidate me had only illuminated his own weaknesses, giving me the clarity to act decisively. The FBI updates arrived sporadically, each one confirming the depth of Bradley Thompson's fraud. Other victims were being contacted, restitution was underway, and the man who had tried to control our lives was finally facing consequences proportionate to his deception. Yet, despite the legal victories, the true triumph was personal. Claire and the kids were safe, confident, and flourishing. I had reclaimed the role of guardian and mentor, not just financially, but morally and emotionally. One evening, I sat by the window, watching the lights of Chicago reflect on Lake Michigan. Duke and Maximus played outside, their joyful barks carrying in the cool breeze. I poured a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the last rays of the sunset, and allowed myself to reflect. I realized that the airport confrontation, the chaos, the threats, and the manipulation were all part of a larger lesson. Life often disguises opportunity as crisis. The moment we feel cornered, humiliated, or powerless is often the exact moment clarity can emerge. Brett had underestimated patience, strategy, and moral resolve. 3 things that cannot be faked or hurried. And in underestimating them, he sealed his own fate. Claire approached, standing quietly by my side. "Dad, thank you for everything." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You didn't need me to fix you. You just needed space to see clearly. I was just here to make sure no one interfered with that clarity. That's all any parent can do: guide, protect, and step back when the time comes." She nodded, tears glistening but not of despair, tears of understanding, empowerment, and relief. "I understand now. Love isn't about giving everything. It's about knowing what's enough, and protecting what matters." The kids joined us, Mason with his history notebook, Grace with her Disney fund, Claire carrying the stack of legal papers. We stood together. A family no longer defined by fear, manipulation, but by respect, boundaries, and shared values. I thought about Brett, or Bradley, and the life he had built through deceit. He had relied on charm, intimidation, and exploitation. But in the end, the truth, combined with decisive, patient action, was stronger than any facade. Justice, real justice, had been served, and the family I loved, the legacy Margaret had entrusted to me, was safe. As winter approached, the Lincoln Park house glowed with warmth, laughter, and a renewed sense of purpose. Mason and Grace played outside, Claire moved confidently through the house, and I finally allowed myself to relax, knowing that the lessons learned, the boundaries set, the vigilance exercised, had secured not only our material safety but our emotional and moral well-being. Duke and Maximus, healthy and cared for, were no longer symbols of obligation but protection, loyalty, and joy. Each moment with them reminded me of the choices I had made, the patience, the strategy, the calm decisiveness that had turned what seemed defeat into triumph. Looking back at the airport, the torn boarding pass, the chaos, and Brett's overconfidence, I understood the final lesson: true power is not in wealth, intimidation, or manipulation. True power lies in clarity, patience, and the courage to act when the moment demands it. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a small, almost trivial-looking disruption, a torn ticket, a sudden confrontation, a challenge that seems inconvenient or humiliating. But in those moments, the foundations of dignity, justice, and respect are either defended or lost. I took a final sip of scotch, watching the Chicago skyline fade into night. The city hummed with life, unaware of the quiet battles waged within its streets. But here, in Lincoln Park, life was secure. Family, integrity, and respect had been restored, and the lesson was clear, not just for me, but for everyone who might one day face betrayal, deceit, or manipulation. Calm, clarity, and decisive action will always outmatch arrogance, manipulation, and fraud. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. Bernard, remember who you are. Patience is strength, boundaries are love, and courage is everything. I had finally understood them fully. Not just in theory but in practice. I had acted when it mattered most, protected what mattered most, and ensured that justice, both legal and moral, prevailed. As I watched Claire tuck Mason and Grace into bed, laughter and stories echoing through the hallway, I felt a deep sense of peace. The family was whole again, not because of money, power, or threats, but because of respect, love with boundaries, and decisive action when the moment demanded it. The airport confrontation had been the catalyst. The torn ticket had revealed the truth. And now, months later, we had not only reclaimed our lives but learned the lessons that would guide us forever. Love without boundaries was chaos, action guided by principle was power. And sometimes, the most important victories come not from confrontation itself, but from the clarity and courage we muster in its aftermath. I set down my glass, glancing out the window one last time before turning away. Duke and Maximus raced through the snow, Mason and Grace's laughter ringing clear, Claire smiling in quiet confidence. The house was alive, secure, and happy. The lesson was earned. The lesson was clear. And this time, it would never be forgotten. The next morning, I woke early, the Chicago air crisp my face as I stepped onto the balcony. The city stretched beneath me, a web of lights and movement. For a long moment, I allowed myself to simply watch. No calls, no threats, no chaos, just a calm morning where the world seemed exactly as it should. I thought about Brett. Bradley Thompson, truly, and the arrogance he had carried. He believed life could be manipulated with lies and charm. That belief had cost him everything. I smiled quietly to myself. There's a peculiar poetry in watching someone's own recklessness set the stage for their downfall. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. I had learned the value of decisive action guided by principle. Claire joined me on the balcony, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Dad," she said softly, "how do you stay so calm, after everything?" I looked at her, the memory of tears, fear, and uncertainty still vivid. "Claire, calm doesn't mean I wasn't angry, or hurt, or scared. Calm is knowing your boundaries, understanding your leverage, and being willing to act when the moment calls for it. It's patience married to purpose." She nodded slowly. "I guess I've been learning that too, about myself, about the kids, about life." "Yes," I said. "You've been tested in ways most people aren't. But look at what you've built: confidence, clarity, and security. That's the kind of foundation that lasts longer than any trip, any gift, any temporary distraction." Mason bounded onto the balcony, backpack still slung across one shoulder. "Pops, Grace and I are making a fort in the snow. You coming?" Grace appeared a second later, mittens in hand, cheeks flushed. "You said we could, Pops." I laughed, shaking my head. "Right, alright. Let's see what you've got." We spent the morning laughing, racing through fresh snow, building forts and tossing snowballs. For a fleeting moment it felt like the world had been rewritten. The tension of the past year, the deceit, the manipulation, the terror of uncertainty, felt like a distant shadow. Inside the house, Claire prepared lunch while I watched the kids. The simple routines, teaching, listening, protecting, reminded me why I had fought so hard. This wasn't about money, or revenge, or proving a point. This was about life, and the right way to live it. The lessons were now deeply embedded in each of us. Boundaries are love, clarity is strength, and courage is necessary when others try to dictate your path. Later that day, Claire approached me with a small envelope. "Dad, I wanted to give you this." Inside was a handwritten letter from the kids, Mason and Grace, thanking me for being their pops, for protecting them, for showing them how to stand up for themselves. It was simple, innocent, and perfect. Their words carried more weight than any legal document or court order. The trust and love of those two small hearts had been hard earned, and it filled me with a quiet pride. That evening, as the sun set over Lake Michigan, casting long golden reflections across the water, I poured another glass of scotch. I held it loosely, savoring the calm that had finally returned. Duke and Maximus played nearby, healthy and joyful. Their presence a reminder of the responsibilities I had fulfilled without compromise. I reflected on the airport confrontation one final time. The torn boarding pass, the chaos, Brett's confidence, and his underestimation of me. That moment had been catalytic. It forced clarity, it revealed character, and it demanded action. What seemed like a small humiliation turned in pivot for restoring an entire family's life. I understood then that life's crises often disguise opportunities. The moment we feel powerless is frequently the exact moment clarity and strategy can make us unstoppable. I had acted not out of spite, but out of principle and necessity, and in doing so, I had reclaimed more than dignity, family and respect. Later Claire joined me again, watching the city lights. "Pops," she said, voice quiet, "what you did, it wasn't just for us. You taught me how to live." I placed my hand on hers. "And you've taught me too, to step back, to trust, and to act only when the moment truly demands it. That's how we protect what matters. That's how we build a life worth living." Mason and Grace came running back from the yard, cheeks red, laughter echoing through the house. Claire smiled, watching them, and I realized something crucial: wealth, power, or control are meaningless if they cannot safeguard those we love. True victory is measured not in revenge or triumph over others, but in the security, joy, and growth of those we protect. The Lincoln Park House, once a battleground, had become a haven. Every corner, every window, every echo of laughter was proof that boundaries, clarity, and courage could transform chaos into peace. The lessons we had learned, sometimes the hard way, were now woven into the fabric of our lives. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Because the airport confrontation, the torn ticket, the deceit and manipulation, it had all been a test. And we had passed. Not because we were lucky, not because we were the strongest, but because we had clarity, courage, and the unwavering will to protect what truly matters. As the night deepened, I finally poured the last sip of scotch into the sink, turned from the window, and walked into the warmth of the home. The lights dimmed gently, the children slept, Claire rested, and Duke and Maximus curled at the foot of the couch. All was as it should be. And in that moment, I knew the truth. Sometimes, the most loving act is to say, enough, and take control. To defend dignity, establish boundaries, and insist on respect. The airport was just the beginning. The lesson had reached its conclusion, and the family, our real family, was finally safe, whole, and thriving. Tomorrow would bring ordinary challenges. Bills, school, work, life's small irritations. But the big threats, the deception, the manipulation, those were behind us. And the wisdom gained, the power of clarity, patience, and decisive action, would guide us forever. I looked around the Lincoln Park House one last time that night, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the wealth, not for the property, not for the legal victories, but for the knowledge that love, respect, and courage had won. And in that victory, there was no comparison, no competitor. No Brett Sullivan or Bradley Thompson who could ever diminish it. The city outside continued its restless hum, unaware of the quiet triumph within this corner of Chicago. And I, Bernard Clayton, finally allowed myself to rest. Because the family was safe, justice had been served, and life at last had been restored. Weeks later, I found myself sitting at the same table where Claire and I had signed the divorce papers, only this time, the mood was entirely different. Sunlight poured through the windows, glinting off the polished wood. Claire and the kids were at the counter, making plans for the weekend. Mason had his backpack open. Grace was drawing, and Duke and Maximus lounged peacefully on the living room rug. I reflected on everything that had happened. The torn boarding pass, the public humiliation, the manipulation, and deceit, it all seemed surreal now. Brett, or Bradley Thompson, as we now knew him, had thought he could control and intimidate us. He had underestimated patience, clarity, and decisive action. He had believed charm and aggression could bend reality to his will. But reality, as I had learned, bends only to truth, preparation, and resolve. Claire approached me with a cup of coffee, setting it gently beside my note. "Oh Dade, do you think he'll ever change?" she asked. I shook my head slowly, smiling faintly. Some people can't. Some people rely on deceit to survive. But that's not your problem anymore. Your problem was protecting yourself and your children. And you did it beautifully. That's what matters. Glistened with tears, but this time, they weren't from fear or despair. They were from relief and clarity. She had seen the manipulation for what it was and emerged stronger, smarter, and more independent. I realized then that the true victory had never been legal or financial. It had been personal, emotional. Cycles and ran over, holding a small envelope. "Pops, this came in the mail for you." Inside was a simple, handwritten letter from one of Bradley Thompson's former victims in Las Vegas. They had lost everything to his schemes, and were now finding restitution. Partially thanks to the tip I had submitted to the FBI. "Thank you," the letter said. "'Cause of your courage, others will have their lives restored." I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not vengeance, not anger, not pride, just the calm knowledge that doing the right thing, even in the face of deception, had ripple effects far beyond what I could see. Grace tugged on my sleeve. "Pops, look, I saved the 10 for Disney." I knelt to her level. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You've earned that. You're learning responsibility, and that's far more valuable than anything money can buy." Claire joined us, smiling as she watched her children grow. "You've taught them so much, Dad. Not just about money, or rules, or safety, but about integrity, about strength. About knowing when to act." I nodded quietly. "And you've taught me that it's never too late to set boundaries, to reclaim control, and to protect what's truly important. Sometimes the most loving act is to say enough, enough manipulation, enough deceit, enough fear. Protect what matters, and let the rest fall where it may." That night, as the city lights reflected off Lake Michigan, I sat alone briefly, the house quiet. Duke and Maximus slept at my feet, the children dreaming upstairs, Claire reading by the fire. I poured a small glass of scotch, letting the warmth seep in, and thought about the journey, the confrontation at the airport, the theft, the lies, the tension, the legal maneuvering, and finally, the restoration. I realized the airport had been more than a moment of conflict, it had been a test. Brett's arrogance had exposed his weakness. My patience, clarity, and decisive action had turned what seemed like defeat into victory. And that victory wasn't about proving a point to protecting family dignity and respect. Life would continue to bring challenges, small and large. But now, Claire, Mason, Grace, and I were equipped with the knowledge with integrity, courage, and decisiveness could overcome deceit, manipulation, and fear. We had been tested. And we had prevailed. I placed my glass down and looked out at the city one last time that evening. The lights of Chicago sparkled like stars scattered across the lake. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the streets. And in that quiet, I understood fully love is not giving people everything they want. True love is protecting what matters, teaching responsibility, setting boundaries, and having the courage to act decisively when integrity is at stake. And with that understanding, I finally allowed myself to rest. The family was safe. Justice had been served. And life, in all its ordinary and extraordinary moments, was finally restored. Because in the end, the lesson was clear: patience, clarity, and decisive action, combined with unwavering integrity, can turn the smallest disruptions into life-changing victories. A torn boarding pass, a moment of public humiliation, a challenge to authority, it all became a catalyst for truth, restoration, and lasting security. And that was the real victory. The next morning, I woke with the sun streaming through the blinds, a gentle reminder that life goes on whether we're ready or not. I sat quietly, coffee in hand, watching the city awaken. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with possibility. I thought about Bradley Thompson, Brett Sullivan, as he had pretended to be, and the choices he had made. He believed he could manipulate people with lies and charm. But he had underestimated patience, clarity, and preparation. He had thought he was clever, untouchable, invincible. And yet, in the span of a few decisive actions, the entire illusion crumbled. Claire joined me in the kitchen, her hair tousled, eyes tired but calm. "Dad," she said softly, "I can't stop thinking about everything that happened. How did you know what to do?" I smiled gently. "Claire, I didn't know exactly what would happen. But I knew the principles. Always act from clarity, never from anger. Protect what is yours, and act decisively when boundaries are crossed. Courage isn't about aggression, it's about knowing when to act and when to step back." She nodded slowly. "I see that now. And I see why you didn't just yell at him or fight him physically. You let him reveal himself." "Exactly," I said. "The moment someone underestimates you as your leverage." Bradley thought he could intimidate me. He was wrong. And because I stayed calm, I could protect you, the kids, and the future. Mason and Grace ran into the kitchen, laughter trailing behind them. "Pops, look at this." Mason held a paper airplane, Grace had a snowball in hand. I chuckled, shaking my head. These little victories, these small joys, were the true treasures of life. Not money, not property, not revenge, but moments of safety, love, and freedom. Later, I reviewed the legal documents once more because I doubted, but because I wanted clarity. Every signature, every clause, every restraining order, and custody agreement was correct. Every asset protected, every potential threat neutralized. The legal framework ensured peace, but the emotional restoration was just as important. Claire's relief, the children's safety, the dog's well-being, all of it had been safeguarded. I thought back to the airport, to the torn ticket, to the confrontation that had seemed so personal, so immediate. That single act of disrespect had triggered the clarity I needed. It was a reminder that sometimes the universe forces a decision, and in that moment, courage and principle become inseparable. As the afternoon sun shifted, casting long golden shadows across the floor, I realized something profound. Life will always present moments that feel unjust, humiliating, or impossible. But those moments are often opportunities to reclaim dignity, to teach lessons, and to protect what truly matters. The airport incident, which once seemed like a failure, had become the pivot for a complete restoration of our family. I poured another glass of scotch, savoring the warmth and clarity it brought. Duke and Maximus lay at my feet, calm and content. Claire was reading with the children, their laughter soft in the background. And for the first time in years, I felt a deep, unwavering peace. I understood that this peace was earned, not given. It was the product of patience, careful strategy, and unwavering adherence to principle. It wasn't about control for control's sake. It was about ensuring that deceit could not invade the lives of those I loved. That was the lesson I wanted to leave behind. And as I gazed out over Lake Michigan, watching the city sparkle in the late afternoon light, I knew that the story, the airport confrontation, the fraud, the recovery, was more than just a tale of personal triumph. It was a lesson in courage, integrity, and the power of action guided by principle. Sometimes, the world tests us in the smallest ways, through a torn ticket, a broken promise, or a moment of disrespect. But in those moments, clarity and courage are your greatest allies. Protect your dignity, protect your family, protect what matters most, and never, ever underestimate the power of acting decisively when integrity is at stake. Because the greatest victories are not measured in wealth or revenge. They're measured in safety, respect, and the restoration of what truly matters. And that is a victory that lasts forever. As the evening settled, Claire, Mason, and Grace joined me on the balcony. The children's laughter read in the crisp air. Duke and Maximus frolicked in the snow below, and the city lights shimmered on the lake. I held Claire's hand and felt the weight of the past lift away. "Pops," Claire said softly, "thank you. For everything. For standing up, for protecting us. For showing us how to act when the world isn't fair." I smiled, warmth in my chest. "You're welcome. And remember, this love isn't about giving people everything. It's about teaching them to stand on their own. It's about boundaries, courage, and respect. That's the greatest gift you can give, or receive." The family huddled together as the first stars appeared in the sky. The past, with its deceit and manipulation, was behind us. The future, filled with trust, love, and resilience, stretched out before us. And in that quiet, golden moment, I finally understood the depth of victory. It wasn't about what Bradley Thompson, had tried to take from us. It was about everything we had reclaimed: dignity, family, respect, and the knowledge that love, guided by principle, could withstand any challenge. The airport, the torn ticket, the confrontation, they had all been catalysts, shaping a stronger, wiser, and more resilient family. And in that lesson, I found true peace, knowing that fight, though difficult, had been worth every step. Because life will test you. People will deceive, manipulate, and lie. But if you stand firm, guided by principle and courage, the truth, and the laws you protect, will always prevail. And that is a lesson worth more than any trip, any sum of money, or any temporary humiliation. It is a lesson worth sharing, remembering, and living by. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm we hadn't known in years. Claire, Mason, and Grace were thriving, more confident, more independent, and happier than I'd ever seen them. The house in Lincoln Park felt alive again, full of laughter, warmth, and love. Not the love bought or borrowed through deceit, but the love built through honesty, boundaries, and courage. I watched the kids one afternoon as they played in the snow with Duke and Maximus. The dogs ran freely, tails wagging, snow clinging to their fur, utterly joyful. Mason built a small fort while Grace attempted a snow angel, both unaware of the chaos that had once threatened their peace. And for the first time in years, I felt truly content, not because I had beaten someone, but because I had protected what mattered most. Claire approached me with a small envelope in her hand. "Dad, this came today. From one of Bradley Thompson's former victims." I opened it carefully. Inside was a simple note, handwritten, "Thank you. Because of someone willing to act with courage and integrity, we have a chance to recover what we lost. You have restored faith in people we thought were lost forever." I smiled, letting the words sink in. Justice, it seemed, wasn't always immediate, but it could be certain when guided by truth and principle. I thought about Bradley. How arrogance and deception had been his downfall. He had underestimated patience, clarity, and decisive action, and in the end, he had paid the price. Claire reached up, taking my hand. "You didn't just protect us, Dad. You taught us how to stand on our own. That's something no one can ever take away." I pulled her into a hug. "That's right. And remember, love isn't giving people everything they want. It's teaching them responsibility, courage, and respect. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to accept than what someone is capable of becoming." The children came running over, interrupting our moment. "Pops! Watch this!" Mason shouted, launching a snowball that hit Grace in the shoulder. Lana erupted. Duke and Maximus barked happily, running around the yard in excitement. I watched them, heart full. Every challenge, every confrontation, every moment of tension, all of it had led to this. A family safe, strong, and whole. I realized that the torn boarding pass, the public humiliation, and the confrontation at the airport had been catalysts, not setbacks. They had forced clarity, action, and ultimately, the restoration of dignity and respect. That evening, as the sun set over Lake Michigan, casting golden light across the city, I stood at the window in my suite, a quiet glass of scotch in hand. The city shimmered, alive and indifferent to human drama, yet somehow beautiful. I thought of the lessons learned: courage, patience, clarity, and decisive action. Integrity, once tested, proved stronger than deceit. Respect, once demanded, could never be taken for granted. I poured another sip, letting the warmth flow, and reflected: life will always test us. People will lie, manipulate, and deceive, but when guided by principle, the right action is clear, and the path forward is certain. It isn't easy, it isn't quick. But it is worth it. The past, with all its chaos and deception, was behind us. The future, bright and full of potential, lay ahead. And I knew that this time, we were truly prepared for anything life might throw our way. Because the greatest victories aren't measured in money, revenge, or possessions. They are measured in safety, dignity, love, and the peace that comes from doing the right thing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that peace fully, deeply, and completely. I turned away from the window, glancing at Claire and the kids laughing in the living room. Duke and Maximus lay content at their feet. And I realized, finally, life had given me back what truly mattered: not a vacation, not a car, not a momentary win, but the enduring gift of family, respect, and the knowledge that courage, clarity, and integrity could overcome anything. And that, I knew, was worth more than anything else in the world.